Welcome to Women's Human Rights Campaign Feminist Question Time. It's brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign, which is an international feminist organisation that promotes women's human rights. The main focus is on defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. You can find more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our declaration on women's sex-based rights. This declaration has been signed by 14,818 people from 127 countries and is supported by 307 organisations. If you're on the website, you can click on the organisations to get their websites, to get through to their websites, and you'll be able to see the wonderful range of groups that have signed up to the declaration. We're going to start off with hearing from Marie-Claire Faray. She is from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Marie-Claire is a researcher and activist on human security, gender inequality, and women's rights in Africa, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She's a member of Common Cause UK, Democratic Republic of Congo, a platform of Congolese women, and member of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILPF. So thank you so much, Marie-Claire, and over to you.
I'm going to be speaking as a Congolese woman, and also my presentation today will focus on Black African women. But as you know, Black African women are from different places, not only from the diaspora, from Africa, but also from the diaspora. And I will try to speak about peace and security of Black African women while addressing race, social class, sex, and gender, cultural identity. As most of you know, Africa is not a country, it's a continent. And Africa has got myriad of culture and population, thousands of language. But one thing that we don't often hear from Africa is the story from African women, because a lot of the story that coming out of Africa has been written not only by men, but also by white men. So a lot of the story from African women have been silenced. So feminism has often had a connotation as being a Western ideology, whereas we all know that the belief in feminism is actually the belief in social, political, and economic equality for all sexes. And actually, if we look at pre-colonial Africa, we had also different legal frameworks, such as the Mandan Charter from the Mali Empire, where the notion of equality was already in some of our pre-colonial era. And we also have different ideologies, such as the Ubuntu ideology, where we know exactly that women such as Kimpa Vita, where women who were actually looking at our humanity first, when they were fighting against slavery and when they were fighting against the colonialism. So really, we've had African women who have always been part of the independence, the struggle for the freedom of human from oppression in Africa. And there's many of them throughout the books, and a lot of them are also coming. We've got new African women who are there, who are Black feminists from the continent. But we cannot forget also some of the Black women from the Caribbean and America who have actually shaped feminism and brought in different ideology, such as the intersectionality, where we talk about feminism for everyone. And we are very inclusive and acknowledge that women and men are all under pressure from stereotype, facing multiple forms of inequality due to toxic masculinity. And so we actually look at each other when we're looking at the Ubuntu philosophy of Africa as I am because you are. And this is actually an inclusive approach of looking at equality and our common humanity. So we are all interconnected, and one of the things that connect all of us as our humanity is actually this programmation of conception, birth, growth, and development, and the decline and death, because we all go through this process, which is a biological process. All human beings go through this process, and it is very important for us to recognize this biological process, which enable us to look at our common our common reality. So one of the things that it's important is, even though we look at our common reality, the gender integrated approach, the feminism, should not be used to undermine our biological reality. So, because most of the time, the wider global feminist talk about intersectionality and looking at all type of issue that we can face as human being. When we look at gender, we talk about, you know, including everybody. However, we should not find our biological reality, which is really our sex, and to silence and exclude other people. So one of the things that is very important for me to discuss today is actually the link that there is, that Black women face when we have to kind of navigate between different identity. Sexism, racism are faces of the same coins. And as Black women, we are faced with different kind of identity. Not only we have to face up with race, we have to face up with our sex, we also have to face sometimes our geographic environment. Some of us have to face the culture, some of us have to face the language, the economic, the income, the social class. So there are a lot of things that Black women go through that are often not recognized. And one of the things that we often face when we are in an environment with other feminists is the racism. And one key issue that we have when we talk about sexism and racism is that we often not looking at biology. Right now, there is all this issue about gender identity. How can we look at gender identity without looking at our biology? And it's the same thing when we're looking at race. We also have to look at our biology, because today, as a Black woman, if I go somewhere and I say that I love classical music, or I love dressing up in trousers, or dressing up in a way that is kind of more culturally Western, that doesn't mean that I become a white woman. No, as I'm still going to be, you know, pigmented, and I'm still going to have my biological, how can I say it, my biological characteristic, you know. So I don't understand sometimes when we talk about gender and we are not looking at female as a biological reality. It's really a big problem, because for a couple of years now, I've been doing some work with women, refugee women, diaspora refugee women, through WILPF and Common Cause UK, where a lot of them come from conflict zone. And as you know, in places like the Congo, rape has been used as a tool of war. And there's, in the Congo has a history of dehumanization since colonization, with the Belgian King Leopold, you know, using the Congo as his property. So a lot of the Congolese were enslaved and they were mistreated. And actually the situation of women in Congo went from full participation during the pre-colonial era to marginalization and exclusion. So the Congolese women and African women in general who have faced slavery and colonization have been dehumanized. And actually, during the training that I do with the refugee women, we look at identifying the different form of violence against women and understanding the legal framework, because through this dehumanization, a lot of a lot of the human rights women have lost actually their humanity. And what I've noticed also is that when we talk about the legal framework, because a lot of the women come from area where male violence is really the norm, has been instrumentalized through capitalism, you know, instrumentalizing masculinity and patriarchy for exploitation of not only women, but of human and natural resources. A lot of the women have been dehumanized in a sense where they don't even know their reproductive organs and understanding their reproductive system. So because of ignorance, lack of education, lack of infrastructure, so there is a lot of ignorance. So one of the things that we've seen in the Congo, for instance, is that the rate of sexual violence was, because Congo was labeled as the capital of rape, without explaining exactly what was going on. So we've done a lot of study to demonstrate that the rate of sexual violence was linked to the war, and was also linked to the militarization of the Congo, because a lot of people were just looking at it as a cultural issue without, you know, separating it from the war and separating it from the whole history of neocolonialization and the militarization of the country. So one of the things that we saw when I was training the women, we've also looked at physical integrity of women that has been breached during in different parts of Africa, and not only in Congo, but in part of Africa where female genital mutilation is practiced. And so this structure here, when I use it during the training, the women are very much impressed, because some of them didn't realize that their reproductive organ was really complex. And it is very important for them to realize that some of the things that are stereotyping them is actually the ignorance of their physiology as women. But for instance, some women and men don't understand that the fluidity of women is very important for the reproduction and for the transport of male gametes to reach the ovaries. So there is a lot of misconception that actually creates the stereotyping. And this image here, I just wanted to show you, it's a little bit in French, but it's just to explain a little bit some of the training that I provide in Congo to women, just to explain a bit about the secretion, that there are different forms of secretion that women don't know, because all of the secretion are seen as dirty, whereas, you know, things like the menstruation and the different type of secretion, the auto cleaning of their vagina, and so things like that they don't understand, but also it is used to stereotype women and to exclude them from different settings. So ignorance has caused a lot of violence, psychological violence. So the ignorance of the women reproductive organ has caused a lot of violence, institutional violence, which actually are crime now under all this legal framework that we have, that a lot of African countries have signed up to, but they are not kind of implementing some of those legal frameworks. So as you know, CEDAW actually reaffirmed the state obligation to women's sex-based rights. And we know that in the CEDAW, the word sex is used to explain that the state has an obligation for women's sex-based rights. And also the Maputo Protocol here mentioned in its preamble that it reaffirmed the obligation of state to women's sex-based rights. Unfortunately, all this today, if we are looking at many of these African countries, they've made a lot of reservation in legal instruments, such as the Maputo Protocol or CEDAW. Some of those reservations are linked to the women's sex-based right to control women and to control girls, and to continue to oppress some of those girls. So today, as we are seeking peace, African women are seeking peace and security while addressing all these different identity and all these different characteristics and all these multiple factors. We have to look at also what are the priorities. When we look at the priority for African women, first of all, is to exist, to exist. And sometimes we face discrimination according to our sex. Really, the fact that all this stereotyping, not only with regard to sex, but with regard to race, have really put us in a frame where we live inequality on a daily basis and every time. And it's actually very important to consider all these factors that are creating violence to our lives. So through ignorance of our biological reality, whether it is sex or it is our biology, individuals participate in atrocity from an inability and critically examine blind allegiance to ideology and stereotype that provide a sense of meaning, comfort in a lonely and alienating world. The only additional thing is I want to say that I have started some training in 2016, training women and men on sex equality using biology and explaining exactly the role of reproductive organs and looking at legal framework and all this. And the return has been really, really fantastic. Not only here in the UK diaspora, where I'm training Afro women from coming from Africa, but also in the DRC, where I started the program in 2016. And it's actually showing that training just on gender equality without explaining the biological reality is really a problem. So, and when you put in the biological reality, you kind of look at critical analysis. People have the time to think about their behavior and how they have been portraying women and why they were stereotyping, and it is actually working. So that's what I wanted to say.
My talk today is going to be on political representation and Liz Truss's speech and announcement that she's going to get rid of quotas and targets. So a bit of background. In December 2020, after 5 years of waiting for the 5 Women and Equality Committee inquiries to announce the outcome of a public consultation exercise on reforming the Gender Recognition Act, Liz Truss, MP, the current Minister for Women and International Trade, put some of the proposed reforms on gender ID to bed. In this highly polemicized speech, Liz Truss says that she wants to reject the approach taken by the left, captured as they are by identity politics and loud lobby groups, except of course for her plans to build 10 new gender identity clinics across the country to make it easier to get a GRC. But as we speak, the gender identitarian lobby, which has all the signs of a cult because they're authoritarian, communal and totalistic, aggressive in its proselytizing, systematic in its programs of indoctrination, relatively new, middle class in its clientele. It has an international vision with its misogynist remit, and they are busy working on oppression definitions to dilute language that refers to females of the species, nationally with the approval of states and internationally with the help of UN Women who have been captured by international development money to push the LGBTQI++, that's some kind of flat earth, everyone's equal policy fiction, by the NGOs captured by the porn and prostitution lobby, promoting the merger of gender identity into sex classification. Because panthers magically don't know someone's sex when paying to rape a woman, and it's women who are overwhelmingly trafficked. But let's forget about that with the flat earth policy. The intention is to confuse categories of oppression with multiple meanings. We have moved from trans women are trans women to trans women are women, and now trans women are females in proposed legislation in the US and Canada. CEDAW, The UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is now being targeted after the institutional capture of UN women by the identitarian cult. Biden himself is now, and his lobby groups are proposing a reality czar to put together a cross-agency task force to tackle disinformation and domestic extremism. Data on everyone's habits and views will be held centrally in this new Ministry of Truth, and I hope Liz doesn't actually refer to that kind of data collection in her speech, where she wants to improve data collection and statistics. So in the preamble to her speech, Liz stated that dignity and humanity, not quotas and targets or equality of outcome, lead to fairness. Read that to mean dignity and humanity leads to fairness, not quotas and targets or equality of outcome. Liz seems to be against any kind of affirmative action to help in achieving fairness and for women to keep their dignity. Nice doublespeak. What she's really saying is that removing quotas, targets and outcomes for women is really better for her because she doesn't have to action the dormant sections in the Equality Act, such as Section 106, dormant since inception. It gives ministers the power to basically keep and publish data relating to the diversity of party candidates seeking selection, i.e. women. Before this new dignity and humanity comes along, Liz, women still have to put up with the dishonesty, histrionics, aggression, violence and arrogance of elected officials pursuing lobbyist agendas, deciding that women really want to be coerced into sexist gendered identities. But I'm sure Liz knows better. Liz, should women just simply include and ignore these loudmouth narcissists in parliamentary committees, party meetings, or even in the toilets, and be happy being unequal in this new proposed technological era of habit surveillance, where mixed-sex toilets are starting to resemble now brothels and voyeuristic pickup points for porn-addled men claiming a gender identity as the password? That's our public life now. What we need is an all departments, ministerial level, sustained campaign to undo the damage done to institutions across the United Kingdom and internationally to secure everybody's human rights, especially women's human rights, targeted by loud lobby groups to commit linguicide and other acts to politically, economically, socially, and geographically mainstream what is an oppressive ideology operating within now a shrinking labour market in the West. We need our political representation quotas and targets as our very dignity and humanity is being erased as women, Liz. Gender identitarianism is an assault on our existence and dignity as women and lesbians, as we are now faced with a terrible new freedom where nothing is true and everything is permitted, which is to say that everything is possible, including changing sex and sexuality to match gender and chest feeding. Well, as for the quotas, the Tories have always hated them, especially Blair's women's quotas, written in the Equality Act until 2030. But they never sought to action Section 106, obliging political parties to publish data relating to diversity of party candidates seeking selection. After all, I suppose, the government really doesn't want to end up sanctioning itself for its own failure to recruit more women in Parliament and more questions being asked by these women. Men in power don't want us in their divisive, ineffectual politics based on impossible principles with its rife clientelism, where there are exchanges of personal favours for political support. The UK political system is a clientelist system where the protection of one group leads to exclusion of another. The gender dimension ticks all the boxes in these systems where opportunities for electoral corruption are gendered in that only those with access to networks, those with connections within the local or national elite, those with resources to finance corrupt behaviour, and those who are already influential in society are in positions to be considered assets in these clientelist networks, and are usually the only ones to be trusted with the sensitive nature of the exchange, i.e. men. Okay, so let's look at the blocks of women's representation and any policies that failed to be implemented. In 2008, the EHRC Sex and Power publication stated that even if at the current rate of increase in the number of women elected to Parliament were to be maintained, it would take about 200 years and another 40 elections to achieve an equal number of women in Parliament. That's for 200 years. So in all parliamentary all-party parliamentary group was set up in 2010 for women in parliament, and its aim was to make parliament more representative of the country. The APPG endeavoured to reach out to women to encourage them into public life and look at ways to increase the number of women in parliament. But it also acknowledged that quotas raise some questions and are not always a popular opinion. Quotas have always been targeted by all male-led political parties, and women's quotas are abused to allow males into women's reserved seats. We all know that. If women give up their quotas, then there is no need to action Section 106 to register data, record data on diversity of candidates up for selection, or to measure targets or outcomes. According to the APPG report, electoral gender quotas have been increasingly used and proved successful in providing a fast track to achieving greater gender balance on the international stage only. There is some pretense of cooperation of the WHRC with the recommendations set out in the UN Indicators for Sustainable Development Goal number 5.5, setting a domestic target of 45% representation of women in parliament, because the UK lags miserably behind a lot of countries. In addition, the Women Inequalities Committee's report of 2016 to 17 recommended that the government should seek to introduce in legislation in this parliament a statutory minimum proportion of female parliamentary candidates in general elections for each political party, while also ensuring that men do not become underrepresented. So the 45% would be acceptable, i.e., men would always want majority votes. It's not 50-50, it's 45% to 55%. But the Minister of Women, Liz, wants to get rid of quotas, stating that the government does not believe that the best way to achieve female representation is to maintain women's quotas. And they don't want to place any additional regulatory burden on political parties, including themselves. 12 years on, the problem of women in parliament has not gone away, but it's not all due to quotas. The problem is with selections and how women are allowed to represent women in a democracy. Women are constrained by ideological and party groupthink, which is male-biased with no regulatory burden imposed. So why doesn't let's just implement Section 106 of the Equality Act? Why doesn't the government bring forward legislative proposals to empower the Electoral Commission to collect and host this data to ensure consistency and transparency from political parties? Liz surely pointed to that in her speech, but she wants to get rid of quotas. So how does getting rid of quotas enhance her drive for dignity and humanity for all? Why has there been an ongoing inquiry into the Gender Recognition Act reforms? Is the Women's Inequality Committee now going to focus on women if we don't want women elected from quotas? Was the purpose of the first trans inquiry about was its purpose mainly about legally changing the definition of women to suit men in a democracy that functions in the interests of those who govern and their lobby groups? We agree, Liz, you shouldn't listen to them at all. Why has the government, since Maria Miller's trans inquiry in 2015, spent millions in grants to organisations with ridiculous views in order to astroturf us into the idea that one can change sex, be covered by the gender reassignment protected characteristic, and take political seats off women in addition to colonising our private spaces? Why is the increased political representation of women a threat? Well, I suppose as women grow in number and in legislative chambers, they will increasingly be able to form strategic coalitions to promote legislation related to women's issues, such as poverty, austerity, economic dependence, and sex-based violence, such as FGM. Men are concerned that a rise in the number of women may influence men's behaviour, causing both male and female legislators to pay more attention to women's issues. Or they are worried that it may provoke a backlash amongst the men who may employ a range of tactics to obstruct women's policy initiatives and keep them outside positions of power. The government's argument for removing quotas seems to be based on having a lower proportion of women who may be more effective than a higher number because female legislators may be able to specialise in women's concerns without appearing to undermine male domination. Well, of course. So we know all these institutions have a male bias, and all the practices are masculine, and they undermine women in their ability to integrate women's concerns and perspectives into policy making. And I'm sure, but if we do reduce the intake by removing quotas, we will increase the predominance of this male bias, I'm sure, Liz. So since for women have been assigned an identity by men within a hierarchy of gender stereotypes, it's men who decide who equality works for, and that it can be downwardly negotiable now, where men can self-oppress and legally morph into any identity by erasing what makes women different to men in language, law, and everyday life. Because it's hard to erase facts like women and men are different and suffer in different ways, and based on that difference, sex matters. So what is it? What's the other problem to do with quotas? It's to do with party affiliation and ideology. It's been very important to men. Let's not pretend, Liz, that this ideology is removed or remote from the libertarian politics that destroyed the left in the 70s, which was just as romanticized and political, with its partly drug-based hedonism, now we're faced with free hormones, and where its ideals of freedom were generally understood in sexual terms, although no one apart from those pesky feminists questioned the male-orientated terms of this ideology at the time. The left also romanticized the Cultural Revolution to overcome the division of mental from manual labor, like a bird now, flying in drag through the inner cities, a symbol of neo-capitalism in a neo-enlightenment painting. When questions like, what is equality, come up, either as a matter of law or equal ops, the left always interprets and reevaluates it in terms of sharing. That is, equality means sharing everything, especially men. They can share women's toilets, changing rooms, sports, prisons, and quotas set aside for women for political representation. But it's also a problem of the mechanisms and how candidates are selected within party disciplinary norms. They determine what kinds of women and men are elected, as well as the specific policy positions they are to adopt once they get into office. So you can't say things like, only women have a cervix, I assume. Selections are predominantly male determined. They vote, they have the voting power. And now more than ever, with women deserting political parties, well, they won't have enough women to even fill up a basic quota. So, some may offer feminist policy concerns for men, including membership of women's caucuses and women's policy machines, caucuses and women's institutes, male policy officers, and we're seeing Lily Madigan's antics and Heather Peto's. But all feminists want is a shared perspective among women as a group to justify calls for greater female political presence, as women and men differ in policy perspectives and preferences. And then we have the arguments that gender is not a fixed identity that women and men bring with them when they enter into politics, but is one that is partially produced and reproduced within the context of legislature. What the thinker thinks, the prover does, I think, is the new philosophy. I just want to say that we should be actively researching and finding out what the government is proposing in bills and the rest of it, and try and use whatever networks we can. But we always have to bear in mind that wherever concessions we make in any deals that we make with government ministers, they have to take into account the ramifications of losing some aspects of our quotas and targets and the need for equality outcomes, because we're not the same, we are different. And that's what I really wanted to get across as a point, that we need to be vigilant and we need to look at everything that the government is producing and provide an opinion on it, and expect our organisations that have been set up since to filter it appropriately, but not change it dramatically.
We're moving now on to Teresa Marques. She's from Portugal. She's going to give us an update and a report on the situation regarding women's sex-based rights in Portugal. So thank you so much for coming, Teresa, and over to you.
I haven't lived in Portugal for quite some time now, for some years, so I had to consult official documents that exist. And I will be explaining the situation of women's rights in Portugal in connection with the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. So as most of you probably know, but in case you don't, I'll repeat what the CEDAW is. So CEDAW is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. There's a committee which is part of the United Nations Human Rights Organizations. And what it does, it's an international human rights treaty that focuses on women's rights and women's rights issues worldwide. It has essentially three types of focus. One is equality, another is non-discrimination, and the final one is state obligations. And when they talk about women's rights, the first article mentions by that it's understood discrimination of women on the basis of their sex. So that's fairly explicit. Why does this matter? Well, it's become quite evident, for instance, now that we're living under the pandemic, that structural inequalities that affect women as a sex-based class had never been eradicated. The pandemic has only made it more clear. So the United Nations women themselves have collected information on this. And so you can see that what the pandemic has done is exposed structural inequalities across every sphere, from health to economy, to security, and women and girls around the world face disproportionate impacts. And so I'll say a little bit about how this is going on in Portugal as well. What this has meant is that hard-fought gains for women's rights are also under threat. So when we talk about state obligations, what does this mean? When a state ratifies a CEDAW, what is the state committed to? So it's one of the more widely ratified conventions worldwide. It's been ratified by 188 countries, and Portugal ratified it in 1980, which is quite a long time ago. It is a legally binding document, and the Portuguese government is obligated under the articles of the convention to effectively implement it. What this means is that all branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches, are bound to implement the Convention Against the Discrimination of Women. So how does that happen? So every 4 years, Portugal must report to the CEDAW committee how the government does a bunch of things, namely how it respects the rights of women. For instance, it can't enact discriminatory laws or engage in discriminatory practices, how the government protects and promotes the rights of women, for instance, by making sure that there are mechanisms for complaints and redress, and that it regulates and sanctions private actors who do discriminate against women, and that it fulfills the rights of women by providing conditions that will ensure the equality in law and in actuality. How does the government report? So how does Portugal report? Well, in Portugal, there is a platform called the Portuguese Platform for Women's Rights. It is a non-governmental organization whose members are all women's rights non-governmental organizations as well. It was created only in 2004. And what it does is it collects information and it produces shadow reports for the CEDAW committee. And it also then asks questions to the government when the government produces its own reports, and asks questions about how it's doing and gives recommendations, let's say. So the latest report is quite recent. It's already covers the period of the pandemic, and it was prepared in October of last year. So I'll now explain a little bit about what's in this report. I can't cover all of it because that's impossible and I don't have the time, but I'll just give you a little bit of an information here. So there are both positive and negative aspects in the period under review. There were some positive developments and there were a few negative developments, right? Some of the negative developments is that the positive aspects that they fell short of expectations. Others were the fact that there were concerns that had been highlighted in previous reports that were not addressed. And there are new, very worrying trends. For instance, there's an increase in hate speech against women. And as I said, also in Portugal, the pandemic is threatening to roll back a lot of women's rights. Portugal is not a wealthy country. It has improved since it's joined the European Union, but it's still not a wealthy country. And now women are suffering a great deal with the pandemic. So just very briefly on positive developments, I won't read all of this, but if you want to have a look. So Portugal has been taking steps to reach parity in political and social representation. So so for instance, in political life, now there are more women participating than ever, around 40% of women in political life, although we still haven't had a woman president or a woman prime minister. In boards and audit bodies, I think it's similar to other developed nations where women are not the majority and they haven't reached parity in any way. In public administration and higher education, universities, etc., women are around 40% nowadays. One of the greatest areas of progress is that it concerns education and research. So women in science and technology, studying science and technology in Portugal are now around 57% of the total people doing science and technology studies, which is a good number. And probably Portugal is one of the countries that is doing better in this regards. And there's also new legislation where Portugal is committed to match obligations in the context of the Istanbul Convention against Violence Against Women. Some of the limitations of these developments. So there are many of the limitations have to do with language and how things like the adoption of the Istanbul Convention are framed in the legislation in Portugal. For instance, with respect to sexual violence, the law doesn't have a concept of consent. It has something like a very weird concept like the knowable will of the victim of sexual violence, whether it's possible to know or would it have been possible to know, rather than the person, whether the woman gave consent. There are other issues that language impacts on developments. For instance, rape crisis or sexual violence referral centers are called crisis centers, not specifically rape crisis centers. And so that means that financial support specific for rape crisis centers or for sexual violence victims is not specifically foreseen. And there are only 2 specialized support services for women and girls that are victims of sexual violence in Portugal. The impact of the pandemic, as I was saying, so this is a very serious in recent years. So women are losing their jobs at a faster rate than men. Women are more infected by COVID than men are. Both facts are to be explained by the fact that women in general do lower paying jobs and are in the care industries or services. And so they are more exposed to infection, and they also have more vulnerable positions, and so they lose their jobs. Women are also facing trouble with the reconciliation between work and family life. And considering that there is a gender pay gap in the family when someone has to decide who's going to stay home to help the care of the elderly or to care for children, it's usually the women who give up on the employment. So the impact on the pandemic is manifest also in regards to violence against women, for instance. So most of the domestic violence victim support services are funded through social games like the lottery, and people are spending less money on these kinds of things. And so there's less money to go around for all the services. Whereas I think this has also happened in other countries. Intimate partner violence that was pre-existing, it has worsened during the lockdown, and incoming calls for domestic violence support lines has increased considerably during the first lockdown last year, for instance. On the negative developments that are really worrying, there is an increase in misogynistic hate speech. This has been heard there's a new far-right party that has said many bad things. There's a lot of misogynistic and hate speech against women online, on social media. That's also not exclusive of Portugal, of course. There are other aspects about changes in language. So, for instance, there was a Commission for Equality and Women's Rights, which is now called the Commission for Citizenship and Gender Equality, and that negatively impacts on women's rights visibility. There are problems with funding for women's rights NGOs, so there's no consistent or reliable funding. And more recently, so in 2018, there was a new law was adopted on the self-determination of gender identity, gender expression, and the protection of sex characteristics. And what is worrying is that it seems to have been done without prior consultation in connection with CEDAW and its impacts on women, which, as I said in the beginning, is something that the government is required to do, is required to check any new legislation, whether it has a negative impact on the discrimination of women on the basis of their sex, of our sex. So I'll say a little bit before I finish, I'll say a little bit about this. So in general, there's a lack of knowledge in public administration and in judiciary on CEDAW. It's the platform for the defense of the rights of women that's been trying to inform the public and institutions about CEDAW, about the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, not the government specifically. The news is basically hopeless because they confuse all terminology. So they confuse gender with gender as a social kind, with gender identity, with gender expression, and sex. So people will swap these terms around without really understanding what it is they're talking about. And as I said, the government doesn't always do proper consultations and assessment of new legislation and how it may impact on women and girls. So in this new legislation from 2018, in February, the government had indeed approved a bill that says that drafted bills or legislative acts that are prepared by the central and regional administration, as well as drafts and bills submitted to Parliament, shall be subject to prior gender impact assessment. But then later in the same year, the new law on the right of self-determination of gender identity was approved, and apparently without being subject to a gender impact assessment. There's a question of whether it hasn't been subject to a gender impact assessment yet, or whether it will at some point be. So the final slide that I have is the question that the Platform for the Defense of Women's Rights in Portugal has addressed to the government was the following. So they say, information before the committee indicates that legislation prohibiting sex-based discrimination has been superseded by gender-neutral legislation and policies and measures to address discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So they ask the government to please provide information about the effects of that approach on the recognition of de facto discrimination against women and indicate the measures that can be taken to promote substantive equality between women and men in accordance with the state's parties' obligations under the articles of the convention. So that's basically the recent information that I have to give, and I'll leave these links. So if you want to consult not just with respect to Portugal, but also to respect to other countries. You have on the United Nations Human Rights Treaties database, you can consult the information, the reports from CEDAW with respect to the country in question, and you can also consult the reports from the countries themselves, right? So both the CEDAW and the countries' reports. And if you want to see more about the work from the Portuguese Platform for Women's Rights, here's the link on the bottom. You have here the link for the platform, right? We are act on behalf of CEDAW in Portugal. I would have to say that many of the structural levels of inequality and discrimination that affect women in Portugal, as in other countries, they just reveal that the legal changes in the law in terms of the language that is used just makes it, completely evident that stopping to talk of women in terms of sex, but to talk in terms of gender is completely irrelevant to the ways that women are being affected in terms of giving up on their work, the difficulty that women had, for instance, to have in having children on their own, something that I did mention. Women during childbirth, they couldn't have company for 2 weeks if they were infected with COVID, for instance. These are things that affect only women. And so it's essential that the law does not stop to protect women as a sex-based class in the countries in which it still does. And where the law is changing, it is important that we have a safeguard for specific issues that impact on women's equality and discrimination.
So we're now moving on to Katya, and Katya Abakamova, she's from Russia, and we're going to, I'm going to ask a series of questions to her. So welcome, Katya. Would you be able to tell us, Katya, how you became interested in women's rights and the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights? Why did you sign it?
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Hello, everybody. So yeah, about 6 years ago, I was volunteering at the Animal Rights Center, and I was just walking with an acquaintance of mine, and we're talking about some general stuff, and she's asking, "Are you a feminist?" And I didn't even know about the feminism much. I mean, don't judge me, wasn't that popular back then. It wasn't on everyone's minds back then. And I told her yes, but I thought about Tom Hiddleston, is that the actor, as my favorite feminist, and I'm deeply, deeply ashamed of that. And then she asked me, "Oh, do you consider yourself a liberal feminist or a radical feminist?" And that question confused me even more because, well, obviously I didn't know that there were many feminisms, but I kept quiet and I told her, well, I'm not exactly sure. But then I started to do some research, and I found out about all the branches of feminism, and the radical seemed to be the most logical for me. So yeah, and women, human rights, I signed because that's just, in Russia, we don't yet have this gender identity craze, at least not that strong as everywhere else. And it was so appalling to see the changes that they're implementing and how those are presented as if the acts of kindness and the acts of goodwill. I mean, I'm aware of mean things, evil things, but when they are, in Russia, people just say, yeah, we're evil, we're mean, we don't care. Do what you will with it. But there, it's like, well, it's equality for everyone, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, women, you don't have any more privacy. Sorry, but men who want to get in your prisons must be the kindest souls, so we must do everything to accommodate them. So basically, that's why.
Thank you, Katya. Would you be able to tell us about Russia? About I understand there was a 2017 decriminalization of domestic violence, so they actually stopped it being a criminal offense. Could you tell us about that and the situation in Russia?
Yeah, that's been a terrible thing, very, very awful. And now instead of it being a criminal offense, it's an administrative offense. So usually domestic violence obviously happens in families. So if a husband beats a wife, then and if she goes to the police, then he would have to pay a fine. Well, obviously he wouldn't pay a fine. They would pay a fine because they're a family and their budget is the same. And so it lowered the rates of women who would complain about this stuff. Not that the rates were particularly high before the legislation, but it sort of sent a message. But at the same time, there was quite a significant uproar about it. So people started talking about it, and this gained some visibility. And one blogger, she even founded with lots of other women an organization. It's like a network of mutual help for women. There are various specialists, there are contacts for various help centers where women could get the help that they might need in such situations. And there was quite a lot of publicity for that. Whereas before the legislation was enacted, it was kind of hidden under the rug. So.
Thanks. Are there any women's rights activist groups in Russia or lesbian and gay groups in Russia that you know of, and what are they doing if they exist?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know of two women's rights groups. So one is it's rather old. I believe they were formed in the 80s or something. Sisters, they're called. They're centers for rape crisis centers. They help the victims of sexual violence, and I believe they're LGBT friendly. And also this You Are Not Alone, that organization that was founded by the blogger that I mentioned a little earlier. They're also, I mean, they exist in the physical world, not just the internet, and they organize some protests. They bring to light some cases where, for example, we have a case of Khachaturian's sisters. There are 3 sisters who defended themselves against their abusive father, and their abusive father died, but the criminal system wants to frame this case as a murder, as if they agreed on it, they planned it, and they're evil, mean girls. But thanks to the uproar that this organization started, and thanks to the support of many people, it almost, I mean, now it's bad again, but the case was almost reclassified as self-defense, which would have meant that, I mean, not 15 years in prison at least. In Russia, their self-defense laws are also quite bad, so I believe they would still face some unfair consequences, because I believe personally that all consequences, negative consequences for them, would be unfair, because their father, he raped them, he abused them. There was a lot of horrible stuff. But anyway, first one governmental body sent the case back to the investigative committee, saying that it was self-defense, but then the investigative committee, they judged there was self-defense, but then somebody, I don't remember the name of the guy, became ahead of something, and he changed it back to murder by a group of people.
Yeah,
So.
but it sounds quite good, as if women are organising and supporters are organising to defend them. So that's quite positive. So my final question is, are there organisations in Russia who are promoting gender identity ideology and trying to change the definition of the word woman?
Well, on the internet, groups of people, but nothing in political sphere, nothing even that's been formulated in the media, that's been verbalized anywhere on any serious level. I mean, we got 99 problems, but that ain't one, at least not yet. And I was just thinking, it's so bizarre and interesting that even though in Russia, as I've told you, and you know, I haven't told about many other problems, but at the same time, the other day I was switching channels on my TV, and I stopped on one governmental channel that usually I don't watch, and they say, you know, they spoil the current narrative that is in Russia, you know, with lots of stuff, but they had a case of Kira Bell this particular day. And you know what? What they said was actually that made sense. And the wrong clock, all right, twice really did work there. And it's so interesting that, you know, sometimes we can find silver linings in worst situation.
So now we're going to go to our final panelist, which is Vaishnavi Sundar. She's from India. She's an independent filmmaker, feminist, writer, and women's rights activist. Many of you will have watched her recently out film, which is called Dysphoric. And we're going to talk to her today, have a few questions for Vaishnavi about the film. She's also the Women's Human Rights Campaign country contact for India. So hopefully everybody will have access to this film, but we'll put it in the chat if you don't. So Vaishnavi, I'm just going to find my questions for you. So what gave you the idea to make the film?
Thank you very much once again for having me. The idea for making this film came from my previous film's cancellation, where for no reason, for the fact that the film had nothing to do with transgenderism at all, was cancelled owing to my personal opinion that I was sharing in my personal social media. And that got me interested about this mentality behind cancelling people for such completely trivial reasons. And the kind of backlash and pushback I was receiving from Indian social media users, kids really, the way they were attacking me, the way they were calling me a transphobe, the way they were even using certain images and GIFs to ask me to shut up, was just so exactly similar to the number of women that have been cancelled in the past who were elsewhere in the world. And that reaction kind of very deeply interested me, because it's a sort of a mentality that was acutely repetitive. Even if it is in the form of abuse, the abusive methodologies were just so acutely repetitive, and that got me very interested in the way transgenderism has sort of anchored itself in India, and I wanted to just research a little more. It was supposed to just be, a sort of a preview of what's going on in the Anglo-Saxon countries, and a sort of a premonition about what's coming to developing countries, especially all countries in the global south. That's just how it started. And it took me about 11 months. And at the end of it, we now have a 4-part documentary, which came from about 30 hours of footage.
Wow. And how many views have you had so far? And what are your next steps for promoting the film? And
Sure. Online, my idea is to just keep sharing it, ask people to, talk about the film like this in avenues like this where more women meet. And my idea really is to get people who earlier were really upset with me for my transphobic views to also have them watch it and maybe hopefully have a conversation with them. Offline, I'm planning to use the film as a means to start conversation with my constituency, members of parliament, members of Lok Sabha, etc., so that they can get a sense of what's going to happen if we don't sort of nip it in the bud, because there is a very, very blatant mix up of the word sex and gender in all the legal documents that come out. And also, I think it's just the conservatism of the country. I don't realize people just really don't resort to using the word sex because it means intercourse, and people are really using gender where they in fact mean sex. So offline, my idea is to also sort of draw like a very clear distinction about the biological term sex and the stereotype that is gender, especially in legal documents, because up until now, after the Trans Act was passed, it was so that people can self-identify as transgender. But recently, during my film, I realized I had almost finished the project, but this news came out and I thought I had to include it. In Bombay, a trans-identified man was allowed to participate in a position that was reserved for female only, biological female only. And it's of particular interest here because in India, these women-only positions are usually used as a sort of a puppetry position. It's usually the husband or the father or the brother or brother-in-law, whoever, who uses this female-only seat to just have some woman in their family to contest in it, but they really do the politics. So it's not exactly favoring the women. And usually these female-only constituencies, possibility of women contesting in these constituencies only happen very rarely, and they happen in different places at different times. So it's not like one place will always have a female-only constituency seat available where she can always contest regardless. It's not like that. It's based on the census, it's based on the needs of the women, it's based on a lot of different criteria that the parliament decides that in this particular constituency this year we're going to have a female-only seat. Now, it's just really wrong that not only have we had full potential to truly contest and do some good for women's rights in India, now that has been hijacked by this male, not in a general category, but in a female-only category, and that really drove me mad. So I had to include that position, that news information in my film as well, and which is why my drive to do work offline has suddenly sensed this urgency.
Yeah, yeah. So I saw you mentioning that, and it's really horrifying. And that seems to be happening in more and more places in the world where men are taking the seats that were reserved for women, or in order to increase women's political participation. We've got a question that was sent in earlier from Josephine Elliott, and she says, "Thank you so much for your brave, informative, and powerful films. How come a minority of trans activists have had such incredible global impact, convincing so many institutions and legislative assemblies to accept such harmful and ultimately absurd practices? She also says, do you think the tide is turning?
It's not just a small number of trans activists that are making all these radical changes in the country, though. We are the academia is totally bought in to the whole queer theory and postmodernist literature that is being taught in liberal arts colleges and universities. So the kids kind of grow up understanding that there are, I don't know, 1,000 genders or something like that. So everybody is fluid, everybody is non-binary and all of that. Plus, only recently we had Section 377 removed, which means now homosexuality is no longer a criminal offense. But at the same time, it does not mean that two homosexual people can be in a marriage contract. That's still illegal. So for now, if you are in love with somebody of the same sex, and if the police finds out, you will not be put in jail. That's the improvement. Now, with that in mind, and the fact that gay marriage is still not legalized, many lesbian women are thinking that the only way they can be with somebody now, after this 377 being made non-criminalized, they believe that the only way they can be with the person that they love is by transitioning. And at the same time, there are these organizations, non-governmental organizations that use in money from corporate organizations that set aside corporate social responsibility funds to a point that literally everybody is parroting the same thing over and over when they go to these organizations to give them gender sensitivity training. They talk about gender, they talk about gender identity, they talk about fluidity. They don't bring up lesbian or gay women, lesbian or gay people over there at all. The principal focus on all these gender conferences and all of this is obviously trans women. And it's really baffling how the chant, the cult mentality that you see in the West and the way they are sort of propagating it down to the very bottom of the pyramid, it is exactly the same over here. And because we sort of carry from a lot from, sort of get inspired a lot from what's happening in these global North countries, it becomes impossible to have a opposing view over here from the global South, because they think they're doing it and we're doing it, so it must be right. So it's not just a few DRAs. It's a like how it is happening in the US and Canada and UK, Australia, everywhere. It's a concerted effort from across the board. And no, the tide is not changing. In about 5 years, we are going to have, really horrible cases of botched up surgeries and regretful transitioners very soon. And the number of ROJD cases in India is already steadily rising.
I think a real strength in your film is that you've done was it 2 or 3 really good interviews with detransitioners? So you're sort of showing us the future. And hopefully we'll be able to get the film out. We'll all participate in spreading word about the film so it's seen by more and more people. Have you entered the film Dysphoric for any festivals or competitions? And will we be able to see that you win the Film Cannes Prize or something?
Oh God, no. One, I know by experience that a film like this will not get selected. Even in a feminist category, even in a lesbian category, or even in a transgender category, this will not get selected because they don't want opposing views whatsoever, and they will try their might to come up with excuses that it is a series, that it is too long, that we had too many applications. Even though yours were so good, we regret to inform you that we can't include it. But they will never say that you're transphobic, therefore we're not taking it in. The film quality is good. They should ideally take it, but they are not. And from the get-go, the moment I decided I'm going to make this film, I had decided that I will not bother doing anything with it other than immediately put it out for public consumption. And that is what I did. And for a lot of film festivals, there's a criteria that if it is available online for free for people to watch, they usually don't take it in as part of the film festival because they charge people to come and watch the films that are on their festival. So if a film is already available for free, why would people pay money?
Yeah. So what's the best way that women can support this film, and what can we do to spread the word really effectively?
Oh, I just want to be able to speak to as many women as possible. And I just want a lot of people to watch this film. So if you have the opportunity where you can do a virtual screening for a little library club or a school or just a group of friends, you want to just sit down and watch and just have a chat. And if we can work out a way in which I can probably answer a few questions, that's not mandatory. I just want people to watch the film. I'm available for a significant amount of time. I'm not going to take up a new project because I have on-ground work here as well with regards to, speaking to the politicians and things like that. So I'm available. I want the message to go out, and I want, if there is an Indian Asian diaspora that's watching and they have these questions that they are until now very hesitant to talk about, they can know that there are people like me who are having these views, and they could reach out, So screen the film, watch it, talk about it, use it, just use it. It's yours. Just take it and use it wherever you want to. Take bits of it, take all of it, do whatever you want with it.
That's so fantastic. So I think let's do that. I think lots of us are doing it, but let's continue to do that and get it out and share it as widely as possible. It's incredibly high quality. So there's just amazing graphics, and is it animation? Who did you get to do the animation and the music?
Oh, we have a fantastic all-female crew as usual with all my films. The animation is done by one Indian radical feminist, but she's anonymous. She goes by name Phantom Pains. And the music is done by somebody from the UK in Bristol, actually. Her name is Jessica, and she's a cellist. And I had decided that I wanted cello to be the theme of the the documentary. So I had put out a word on Twitter saying I was looking for musicians, but I was very upset that most queer type people would write to me, and I have to really explain to them and things like that. She just mentioned in the bottom that if it helps, I'm a radical feminist too, and I said, you're on board. Let's just work together.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And what are you going to do next, Vaishnavi?
Oh, I don't know. It's like 11 months of non-stop work from morning to night, and as most of you know, in WHRC, I do not sleep. I'm like this perpetually awake person. It feels suddenly like I have no job. I've been fired from somewhere. But I'm writing to a lot of people, writing about the film, trying to find out which politician that I can talk to, etc. So that's going to take me a couple of months. And also with COVID, I don't think I can actually go and make a live action film just yet. So at the moment, I think I'm going to continue. It's like how I feel about all my film. The film gets made, but the work actually begins after the film gets made, to utilize the film and use that to actually make on-ground changes. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. Ever since this film is out, and I have been public about all my experience, and my face is out there, my name is out there, everybody's saying that it's pretty brave, and it's really commendable and things like that. I understand and appreciate that a lot, but I also realize that there is so much we can do, even if we don't have to have this public life about our politics. And I think that time to do something about this whole gender identity business is right now. It didn't hit me as to how severe it is until that news came out where this man started contesting in a female-only position seat and won. It hit me very hard at that time, and I realized now all these friends of mine who have until now been very passive, I'm encouraging them to speak about it. May not even be on social media or in front of their employer, but just to family or your brother or your friend or something like that. That conversation needs to happen now. There is a gargantuan urgency about this situation, I feel. Thank you.